Nico's world began in a dim tunnel beneath the city streets, where the rumble of trains overhead was a distant thunder, and the only light came from flickering sodium lamps spaced 100 yards apart, like watchful sentinels. He crept along the rusted rail ties, his sleek gray fur blending with the dusty ballast, whiskers quivering to sample every vibration in the stale air. Above him, the third rail hummed with lethal power, and every footstep created a muted echo against the vaulted brick ceiling. For years, Nico had navigated this underground maze, his keen nose mapping its labyrinthine corridors far more accurately than any blueprints in some distant engineering office. Tonight, however, the tunnel's familiar rhythm felt off-kilter. The trains thundered past at irregular intervals, brakes squealing sharp warnings that rattled loose pebbles beneath his paws. The stale scent of oil and metal gave way to something darker, a faint, acrid tang that nipped at his nostrils and burned his throat. He paused near a service alcove where a reservoir of standing water reflected the wavering glow of a lone lamp. Leaning forward, he inhaled deeply, nostrils flaring. There it was, an odor like rotten eggs mixed with the metallic bite of spilled gasoline. A gas leak. He had encountered such danger only once before, when a careless torch set a wooden support beam alight, and the memory of that fiery inferno still made his fur bristle. Nico's heart raced as he gauged the vapor's density. It clung to the tunnel corners in pale, invisible tendrils that could explode at the spark of an unwary lighter or an errant electrical arc. He pressed his small body flat against the cold brick wall, tail flicking in rapid warning. Above him, the distant chime of a maintenance cart's wheels approached, workers moving through the dark with flashlights and toolboxes in hand, oblivious to the creeping menace beneath their boots. Nico knew the railway's safety protocols. Any detection of gas meant immediate evacuation, sealing of the tunnel, and hours of lost service. But first, he had to get help. With urgent determination, he scurried backward along the rail ties, retracing the path he had memorized, head tilted low to the ground to keep the gas drifting toward his sensitive muzzle. The tremor of an oncoming train vibrated through the rails, moments away. Nico pressed himself into the gap between the tracks and the tunnel wall, whiskers twitching in the onrush of wind as the train whooshed past, its steel wheels shrieking metal against metal. When the clamor subsided, he darted onward, past the emergency exit marked on the wall with fading stencils, and into a branching corridor that led toward the maintenance bay. Every corner held another test. At one turn, a broken puddle reflected the lamp's glare and threatened to trap his paws in the oily film atop the water. At another, a fallen toolbox blocked half the path, forcing him to weave between exposed cables that hissed with a faint electrical charge. Yet Nico did not falter. His entire life had prepared him for this moment. The nights spent exploring the forgotten recesses of the subway, the countless foraging runs through freight cars and storage rooms, the razor-sharp clarity of his senses honed by survival on the edges of human reckoning. As he emerged from the final curve into the maintenance bay, a cavernous chamber lit by high-voltage lamps, he spotted them. 3 engineers bent over a control panel, heads together in discussion, oblivious to the silent threat creeping closer. Nico lifted himself onto a spool of cable and let out a series of high-pitched squeaks, urgent, insistent, impossible to ignore. The engineers looked up, startled, as he scurried toward the panel and began tapping at the gas sensor's alarm button with his tiny forepaw, triggering the red beacon that flashed like a cardiac warning light. The control room door hissed open automatically, and an alarm bell began its relentless peal, echoing through the tunnels and forcing every worker to pause in shock. In that moment, the gas leak ceased to be an invisible menace and became the central crisis of the night shift. The engineers shouted commands into their radios. "Gas detected at sublevel 3. Evacuate the tunnel. Shut down all power." Nico sat back on his haunches, chest heaving, as the lights switched from white to pulsing red and klaxons sounded across the subterranean network. He watched the engineers race to the corridor's entrance, flashlights bobbing as they escorted each other to safety. Beyond them, the dark tunnels yawned, But no one ventured forth until technicians arrived with gas detectors and ventilation fans. And as the maintenance crews scrambled to seal off the leak and purge the poisonous air with forced jets, Nico descended from his perch, whiskers still quivering with adrenaline. He melted back into the shadowed maze of the subway, unseen but for the faint echo of his rapid heartbeat, a reminder that sometimes the smallest sentinel bears the greatest gift, the gift of warning, carried on a rat's nimble feet and keen nose, safeguarding the vast world above from the dangers that lurked in the depths below. Nico paused at the junction where the northbound and southbound tunnels split, the stale recycled air swirling through the crossover passage in faint eddies. He sniffed the breeze again, whiskers quivering like antennae probing for danger. Here, the rotten egg stench was stronger, so strong that he recoiled, shaking his head and releasing a sharp squeak of alarm. He had learned long ago that ordinary subway air carried odors of grease, mold, and the iron tang of blood from spilled drinks. But this was different, a chemical acridity that clung to the mucous membranes, promising disorientation or worse if inhaled too deeply. Carefully, he edged along the wall past yellow-painted signage, warning of high voltage, his pads silent on the concrete ledge. He pressed his nose into a narrow grate covering an air shaft. Beneath that grill, the faint hiss of pressurized gas churned the stale tunnel air like steam escaping a faulty valve. Nico's heart thundered in his chest as he recognized the sound. Not a train's ghostly whoosh, nor a venting compressor, but the hiss of a leak. He backed away only long enough to compose himself, then returned to the grate and flattened his body against the wall. Whiskers brushing the cold metal, inch by inch, he traced the length of the shaft, identifying the precise spot where the pressure was greatest. Above him, a single lamp flickered, a remnant of an older lighting circuit, and its wavering glow cast long, dancing shadows across the ribbed ceiling. The gas vapor, heavier than air, pooled near the floor in a thin gray ribbon that glowed faintly under the lamp's pale light. Nico dipped his head, inhaling carefully through flared nostrils, then raised it quickly, eyes blazing. This pocket of gas, if disturbed by a spark, say, from a passing train's wheels or an errant electrical arc, could ignite in a catastrophic underground fireball. He turned and darted deeper into the crossover, following a bank of service conduit toward the maintenance bay. As he ran, the hiss of the leak grew louder, punctuated by the distant thump of a supply trolley barreling down the main tunnel. Nico's paws flew over the metal grating that covered a drainage channel, and he leapt up to a low platform where workers stored replacement parts. He nudged a loose wooden crate, sending it skittering to the floor and clattering against a bundle of cable. The startled echo of the noise carried back down the tunnel, alerting a lone electrician who had come to inspect the older lighting circuit. The electrician spun at the sound, flashlight beam sweeping the shadows until it landed on Nico's sleek form, crouched atop the crate. The rat's fur bristled, whiskers still trembling with urgency, and he squeaked again, this time a rapid staccato that conveyed imminent danger. The electrician's eyes widened as he caught the faint glow of vapor at the grate. He dropped his flashlight and lunged toward the air shaft, slamming his radio to life as he barked into the microphone. "I've got a leak at crossover 4-3. Evacuate immediately and shut all power." In that charged moment, Nico pressed himself against the far wall, breathing hard but focused. He had mapped the threat, guided a human to its source, and set in motion the alarms that would purge the deadly gas. As klaxons began their urgent wail and red warning lights flickered to life down the tunnel, Nico slipped back into the deeper darkness, his heartbeat echoing in the vault of brick above, ready to lead any stragglers to safety and to ensure the subway's hidden arteries remained free of the invisible peril he alone could sniff out. Nico slipped through the widening corridor that connected the service tunnels to the main line, each paw step measured and silent against the damp concrete floor. Above him, the overhead conduit snaked along like a metal serpent, its riveted joints dripping condensation that plinked into shallow puddles. The hiss of the leak behind him had faded into the distance, replaced by the distant thunder of an approaching train, its headlights a ghostly blur through the darkness beyond the tunnel mouth. Nico knew he had only minutes to complete his investigation before the line reactivated, and the fumes spread even farther. Carefully, he navigated around a stack of discarded wooden pallets, whiskers brushing against a stray coil of cable that snapped back at his touch. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a maintenance alcove marked Emergency Shutoff. Here, massive red valves stood guard like sentinels, their painted surfaces chipped by years of neglect. Nico climbed onto the base of one valve, his sharp claws gouging shallow scratches in the steel as he peered at the identification plate. Line 12, ventilation supply. The rat's heart pounded as he realized that this valve controlled the airflow not only for this section, but for the entire northbound line. If he could trigger its mechanism, if he could somehow wedge the valve open or closed, he might redirect fresh air into the contaminated zone or starve the leak of oxygen, slowing its spread until engineers arrived. His whiskers trembled as he tested the valve wheel with his forepaws. It felt stiff, untouched by human hands for weeks. With a deep breath, Nico wrapped his tiny paws around the rim and, using all his strength, nudged the wheel. At first it held fast, then creaked ominously as metal ground against metal. A trickle of vapor drifted through a nearby vent, and Nico pressed forward, paw over paw, until the wheel shuddered and turned a fraction. The valve's spindle groaned, and the hiss of escaping gas elsewhere in the tunnel seemed to falter. Encouraged, Nico pushed harder, rotating the wheel in slow, precise degrees until the valve clicked into a new position, rerouting the fresh supply fans to push uncontaminated air down the crossover, rather than drawing the pollutant toward the main tube. As the valve settled, Nico heard the distant roar of ventilation fans shift pitch, a sign that his intervention had worked. Clean air was now surging toward the leak, diluting the concentration of gas in the immediate area. Yet the rat knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The leak itself still needed to be found and sealed. He descended from the valve and retraced his path back toward the junction, following the faintest swirl of remaining vapor that lingered near the floor. His nose guided him like an invisible thread, leading him past the emergency lights flicker and beneath the grumbling rumble of idle service elevators. At last, he arrived at a section of tunnel lined with heavy-duty piping. One pipe, thicker than the rest, glowed with a pale sheen of moisture, condensation driven by the pressurized gas within. Nico pressed his nose against a weld seam and felt a slight warmth where that seam had begun to split under the pipe's stress. Inch by inch, he scuttled along the length of the pipe, whiskers brushing the surface until he found a faint bulge, a telltale bead of gas sweating through the metal. A single breath of that vapor would be enough to send him reeling, but his instincts held him steady. He raced back toward the nearest emergency pull station, an orange handle mounted to the wall, marked Emergency Shutoff Gas. Standing on his hind legs, Nico reached up and yanked at the handle with all four paws. The station's alarm klaxon shrieked to life, its echo tearing through both northbound and southbound tubes. Simultaneously, red indicator lights blinked on overhead, and a hydraulic mechanism engaged, closing the main gas supply valve farther down the line. The hiss of the leak dwindled to a soft wheeze as the supply pressure dropped, buying precious time for the maintenance crews to arrive. Panting, Nico retreated to a safer corner, listening to the emergency sirens and the echoing vibration of distant trains grinding to a precautionary halt. He had traced the leak's source and triggered the shutoff, and redirected the airflow to protect the tunnels and the trains scheduled to run at dawn. As his whiskers settled and the tunnel's resonant hum shifted from threat to controlled calm, Nico allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. Deep beneath the city's streets, he had proven that even the smallest sentinel, with courage, cunning, and a nose for danger, could safeguard lives above and below the rails. Nico darted along the edge of the tunnel, senses still ablaze from the valve turning and knob tugging he had just performed, his heart hammering with urgency. He followed the thinning trail of gas fumes through the service hatchway until he reached the mouth of the platform's emergency control room, a glass-paned alcove tucked into a recess between the rails. Inside, two night-shift train operators sat slumped over a console of blinking indicators and levers, one half asleep against his hard hat, the other poring over a stack of tardy train manifests. A low red glow from the emergency alarm button cast their faces in ominous relief. Pressing himself flat against the polished metal threshold, Nico inhaled sharply and let out a rapid series of high-pitched squeaks, urgent staccato chirrups that carried through the stale air like a living siren. The operators jerked upright, eyes wide and hands snapping toward the console. Before they could silence his cries, Nico bounded onto the control panel itself, claws tapping out a frantic Morse code on the plastic surface. He hopped onto the large red emergency gas shutoff button at the center of the console and pressed it down with all his weight. A shudder ran through the room as the panel's speakers crackled to life with an automated announcement. Attention all personnel, gas leak detected. Initiate full evacuation procedures. Do not use electrical equipment. Red strobes burst to life overhead, and the heavy blast doors at the far end of the tunnel began to grind shut, sealing the main line. The operators leapt to their feet, one grabbing the radio microphone and shouting into it. All stations, gas leak. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, evacuate immediately. The other flung open the door and stabbed at the call box outside, summoning the maintenance team and alerting station control. Nico perched on the edge of the control panel, tail flicking, as the operators scrambled to execute emergency protocols, cutting power to track circuits, diverting oncoming trains, and unlocking passenger doors. Beyond the control room, the distant clang of the pressurized doors echoed through the tunnel, followed by the murmur of startled passengers stepping off idling trains. Sweat streamed down the operators' faces as they confirmed each station's clearance status. But they never paused to chase away the disheveled rat, whose frantic warning had set everything in motion. Instead, they shared a look of stunned gratitude, mouths still agape, as they keyed in the override codes to hold all trains until the leak was contained. Nico watched their hurried movements, whiskers vibrating with relief. He climbed down from the panel and slipped into the safety of the adjacent utility closet, his small form vanishing just as the first hazmat crew's boots rattled on the platform. He could hear their muffled voices. We've got residual fumes at Section 4, and knew that his warning had given them the precious minutes they needed. His chest heaved as the control room lights dimmed to emergency mode, and the tunnel's normal hum of wheels and electricity fell silent, replaced by the drip of condensation and the steady ticking of the evacuation siren. In that hush, Nico allowed himself a moment to breathe, the first true calm since he had discovered the leak. He pressed his side against the cool concrete wall, whiskers brushing the chipped paint as he listened to the distant thud of boots receding, work orders being issued, and the methodical churning of fans in the ventilation shafts. Beneath the rails, he felt the tremor of human gratitude, a pulse that vibrated through the tunnel's bricks and steel. And as he slunk back into the maze of service passages, Nico, the tunnel rat, carried with him the quiet pride of one who, through chittering alarm and fearless intervention, had sounded the first warning that saved countless lives above and below the city's streets. Nico slipped from the cramped utility closet back into the corridor that led toward the heart of the leak, every sinew taut with purpose. The hazmat crew's boots thundered behind him, but their bulky suits limited their access through the narrow service passages. Nico, lithe and fleet, darted ahead, whiskers brushing the chilled concrete as he navigated the branching tunnels. He emerged at a low-ceilinged junction where two maintenance engineers, one clutching a handheld gas detector, the other grappling with a fallen toolbox, had been caught unaware by the sudden flare of alarms. Their faces were etched with panic as the gas meter's needle quivered deep in the red, and the faint hiss of leaking vapor seemed to whisper of impending disaster. Without pause, Nico chirped sharply, his urgent squeaks crackling like static in their helmets' microphones. The engineers spun toward him, eyes wide, and one bent down to scoop him into gloved hands. Rather than cower, Nico pressed against the engineer's palm, then squirmed free and bolted back down the tunnel, tail flicking as an invitation to follow. Confusion gave way to resolve as the engineers exchanged hurried glances. That rat, one muttered. He knows the way. They abandoned the heavy toolbox, already sparking with stray electricity, and sprinted after Nico, the gas meter's alarm hammering a frantic rhythm in their ears. Nico led them through twisting passages, weaving past steam pipes that hissed with hot condensation and around stacked crates of spare parts that sent menacing echoes when brushed aside. The vapor trailed him like a living shadow, pooling in low spots until Nico veered into a narrower shaft where the leak's edge curled like a ghostly tongue. He paused at a junction marked Emergency Exit, then darted left, away from safety, toward a side ladder affixed to the wall. The engineers caught up, breathless, as Nico climbed nimbly, scaling the rungs faster than either man could match. But they followed, gripping the ladder's side rails, helmets brushing the low ceiling. At the top, Nico bounded onto a graded catwalk overlooking the mainline tunnel. Below, train tracks glinted under emergency red lights as signaled trains ground to a halt. He pressed his paws against the graded floor and peered down at a lone track worker who had been inspecting rail welds when the alarm sounded. The man's flashlight lay abandoned, and he clutched his throat as the fumes stung his eyes. Nico's squeak echoed over the rail, and the worker looked up in startled recognition. The two engineers climbed onto the catwalk behind Nico, and together they guided the groggy worker back toward the ladder, offering his arm as Nico darted ahead to ensure a clear path. They descended in a rush, boots slipping on the rungs, slick with moisture, before spilling into the crossover passage. Nico waited at the grate-covered air shaft, squeaking once more. The engineers led the fatigued worker past the grate, while Nico wedged a metal bar, a scavenged baton, against the valve wheel they had previously turned, preventing it from rattling closed under the weight of the shifting airflow. The worker, blinking and gasping for clean air, stumbled into the grateful arms of the hazmat team who had followed close behind. Each technician's eyes flicked to Nico with a mix of astonishment and relief as they secured the worker in a safety harness and escorted him through the emergency exit. Behind them, the final knots of vapor dissipated as the ventilation fans, now redirected by Nico's earlier intervention, swept the tunnel clear. The engineers, rain-slick and covered in grime, knelt to pat Nico's back in reverent thanks. He chirped softly and slipped away into the tunnel's shadows, not for glory or reward, but because there might still be more lives to save in the subterranean maze. As the morning shift flooded onto the tracks above and the city's bustle resumed deep beneath the surface, Nico, the tunnel rat, guide, scout, and unsung hero, retreated into the churning underworld, ready to answer the next urgent call of danger, with nothing but his keen nose and unwavering courage. Nico's paws pattered urgently along the narrow service corridor as the hazmat crew's heavy boots thundered behind him. The tunnel flickered with emergency lights now, pulsing red beacons that threw shifting shadows across damp concrete walls and tangled conduit. Every corner brought a new hazard, a flood of pressurized air seeping from a ruptured pipe, steam condensate slicking the floor, and here and there a loose panel sparking with residual electricity. Nico's whiskers twitched with focus. He had led the workers past the worst of the leak, but their path to the exit still lay through a maze of tunnels he himself had only recently mapped by scent and sound. He darted over a patch of oily residue, narrowly avoiding a slip that would have sent him sprawling onto an exposed junction box. Beyond, the corridor opened onto the main platform cavern, its vaulted ceiling echoing distant horn blasts as trapped trains sat silent on the tracks. Nico skittered down the support beam's flanged edge, cooing sharply to announce their approach. The lead engineer, breathing through his respirator, caught sight of the rat's slate-gray silhouette against the tunnel's gloom and followed without hesitation, radio crackling as he relayed Nico's direction to the team at the exit stairwell. They rounded a bend into the crossover tunnel, just as the gas sensor's meter flickered dangerously high again, a warning that residual pockets of vapor still clung to alcoves and drainage grates. Without pause, Nico scaled a low pipe at the tunnel's lip, then dropped onto a narrow ledge beside the emergency exit door. He let out an insistent squeak and skittered to the door's manual release lever. The engineer lunged forward, grasping the lever and yanking it down. The doors hissed and clanged open, revealing the stairwell beyond. One by one, the workers, faces streaked with sweat and grime, ascended the steps two at a time, pressing against the cool concrete walls as they climbed toward the fresh air above. Nico led them up, pausing at each landing to ensure no one lagged behind. At the third story, a maintenance apprentice slipped on the worn concrete edge. The engineer caught his shoulder and hauled him upright, while Nico's sharp squeak spurred the apprentice to keep moving, fear-driven but determined. Above, the stairwell opened onto the platform's mezzanine, its flush of yellow emergency lighting a beacon of safety. The workers spilled out, blinking against the sudden brightness, as medic and security personnel rushed to meet them with oxygen masks and first aid kits. Nico stood on the platform's tiled edge, whiskers twitching, watching as each evacuee was treated and directed away from the tunnel mouth. The roar of resumed ventilation fans buffeted his fur, carrying the stale scent of the still-clearing gas away from the tracks. Finally, the last engineer stepped out, shoulders slumping with exhaustion, and dropped to his heels beside Nico. He cradled the little rat in gloved hands, murmuring gratitude as Nico nuzzled into his palm. Behind them, the platform doors slid closed, sealing the tunnel once more for inspection and repair. In that moment, Nico allowed himself a satisfied exhale. He had guided them through every peril: loose conduits, slick floors, hidden vapors, and led every soul to safety before the morning rush resumed above. As hazmat crews sealed off the crossover and maintenance crews prepared to enter the tunnel in full protective gear, Nico slipped away into the station's underbelly. His heart still raced, ears alert for any lingering hiss of gas, but deep down he knew that, for the moment, the subway beneath the city was safe, thanks to a small tunnel rat whose courage and cunning had turned a race against time into a life-saving triumph. As dawn's first pale light filtered down the stairwell and through the station's upper entrances, the city's normal rhythm resumed with little outward sign of the night's near catastrophe. Commuters poured onto the platform, rubbing sleep from their eyes, while station staff greeted them with warm greetings and hot coffee. Yet beneath this routine bustle, the story of the midnight leak and its unlikely hero, Nico the tunnel rat, had already begun to ripple through the subway's veins. In the control room, engineers pored over data logs, tracing the leak's progression and the automatic shutdowns that had been triggered. They marveled at the early warning and precise interventions that saved the day, a framed commendation hastily printed on waterproof paper, now hung on the wall beside the main console, in grateful recognition of Nico, whose keen instincts and courageous actions safeguarded our system and its patrons. One technician leaned close to it, tracing the rat's name with a finger before straightening to welcome the morning shift with an emphatic nod. On the platform, hazmat crew members, still clad in protective overalls, spoke in hushed tones of the small gray scout whose squeaks had guided them true. The station manager, clipboard in hand, joined them, laying out plans for new gas detection sensors and better signage in the crossover passages. And perhaps, he said with a wry smile, we'll erect a little monument for our brave tunnel rat. The workers laughed softly, exchanging looks that mixed exhaustion with pride in their subterranean comrade. Meanwhile, Nico slipped from the platform's edge into the labyrinth of service tunnels, guided by instinct toward the quieter reaches he called home. He paused in a familiar alcove beneath a track inspection hatch, his own private lookout, where the morning train rumbled over. As its wheels clicked overhead, he braced his paws against the cool concrete, whiskers twitching in contentment. The air here was fresh for the first time since the leak, drawn down the stairwells by the station's fans and scrubbed clean by hours of ventilation. Nico breathed deeply, his small body still humming with the adrenaline of his mission. Along the service corridor's graffiti-stained walls, maintenance crews had scrawled a single phrase in chalk: "Thank you, Nico." Across from it, a tiny wooden platform now held a scrap of cheese and bits of fruit, left by workers as tokens of gratitude. Nico approached the offering, sniffed it once, and accepted a sliver of cheddar with dignified grace. He nibbled thoughtfully, coils of scent from the cheese, mingling with memories of steel and gas and the night's frantic rescue. Then, as the city above roared awake in traffic and chatter, Nico turned and vanished into the deeper shadows, ready to answer any new alarm his keen nose might detect. For beneath the endless miles of subway tracks, among the cables and conduits and echoing archways, the sentinel of the sewer remained ever vigilant, a small hero in the city's hidden underbelly, whose courage ensured that the life above always ran smooth beneath his watchful paws.